going on, guys? This is the Fullstack bro coming at you with another video today. In today's video, we're going to be getting serious a little bit. I'm going to talk about the worst interview I ever had as a full stack developer. Okay. Now, this was like a couple years back. I want to say like 6 years ago. I was actually looking for a new job and I wanted to do full stack development, right? And I was applying, I was getting actually phone interviews, like my whole calendar was blocked. Like the whole week I had interview after interview, everything was going great. Then there's this one particular company that was based out of San Francisco that reached out to me. I had the initial phone interview and then we had a second follow-up interview. They were looking for React.js, C#, understanding of RESTful APIs, database management. The title was for a senior development position. And I felt like, okay, I already have about 3 years of experience as a software developer. It's time to level up to senior. Instead of me preparing for this interview, I decided it would be a good idea to just go off of what I know, right? Because I got 3 years of experience. This should be okay. Like I should be able to hit this interview, no problem. There's a couple issues with that. Number one is that I wasn't doing interviews at the time. I really thought that I knew everything. I thought that I had the skills to get this job. And as a developer, you already know you don't know everything. You're always a student of the game. It's never like I know 100% of this and that's it. It's you know enough until you don't know anymore. Fast forward to the interview. I was asked basic questions like, what is append and prepend, right? And append and prepend in JavaScript deals with either adding a value to an array in the beginning of the array or at the end of the array. I couldn't even answer that. Okay. I was like sitting there on the phone, like, what? I don't know. Like just a deer in the headlights, didn't know what to do, what to say. And understanding promises in JavaScript, that was another question. Like, what is a promise? If you're calling an API, you're expecting a promise. You're expecting data to come back. If you're getting data, if you're posting data, there's always going to be a status, whether it's 200, okay, 502, 420. 502 is just something internally is wrong. There's an error. 422 means you don't have access to that API, et cetera, et cetera. And how would you go about dealing with those promises and errors? Usually you will use a try-catch method to deal with that. If you have an error handling library already set up, it will handle it for you. Like, for example, if you're using Axios as your API library, it will handle all that stuff for you, so you don't have to do it. But I didn't know that. So that was another question that I flaked on. And usually when you're dealing with promises, you have to use asynchronous functions. So you would have to wait. If you don't use an asynchronous function when calling an API, this is what happens. Call that API and you think you got data back. So if you do a console log around the data that you're getting back from the API or like a print statement, you're going to notice that there's a promise in that console log. And that usually means because you have to wait for the API to finish getting that data or posting that data to get that promise back. Just asking those basic questions around like JavaScript and what's a .filter function do? What does a reduce function do? What's the best way to go about dealing with for loops? All this stuff I couldn't even answer. Now that was a huge hit to my ego. Okay. And then also we had a coding challenge and we're gonna pause here and I'm gonna show you guys exactly what that coding challenge is and how you would go about solving these problems. Let's switch over to the code real quick. All right, guys. So here's the coding challenge that I had to do for that interview. Is pretty much what I had to do. So I just put together like just simple React project. This is using Vite, and I'm also using a JSON server on the back end too, just to kind of use the API stuff. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this interview question is basically we need to call an API with the user's endpoint and get all of the users and the properties of that user's ID. It will have an ID, first name, last name, email, state, and hobby. Okay. We need to output the list of users to the screen in an unordered list, which is just a bulleted list, right? Then from there, we would have to create another bullet list that combines all the info of that user with their hobby. So example would be like first name, last name, like, Jane Doe is from New Jersey and their hobby is eating ice cream or going to the gym or whatever, right? That satisfies two questions. Then we're going to create a input field that's labeled hobby and create a way to update the hobby for the second user in the list. So we would need to create a text input field and also a button that would dispatch an action to update that information. Then we'll create another input field where we could filter on the user's location, so their state. So if you were to put in like New Jersey or California, anything like that, it should filter out the list. And if it doesn't, we have to finally add a button that will reset the list to its original user list. Okay, so pretty straightforward. If you know anything about React, this should be super simple to do. So I'm just first thing that we're going to do is just create an interface, right? It's because we're using TypeScript, by the way. So whenever you're using an interface is just for like defining a type within a component. And if it's only going to be used once, you could define a type just for any object that's going to be used throughout the application. So you don't have to go about creating an interface every single time. So I'm going to use an interface. I'm going to call this user. And then based off of the declaration of number one, we're going to add in the ID. The ID is a number. And you can see right here that I'm already getting what the next line is in the list. This is because I'm using Codium. Now, I have a link in the description for that. But basically, it's just like GitHub Copilot, but it's free. And it allows you to refactor your code, explain exactly what the code is doing. You can ask it questions to like create a certain functionality if you need to, if you're too lazy to do it. It's very neat. I highly recommend it if you don't have the funds to get GitHub Copilot. Okay, so it's not first name here, but it should be first name, all lowercase, and everything else is going to be outlined for us. So we're just going to hit tab on our keyboard, and that's going to output everything that we need. So simple, sweet. You don't have to go line by line by typing this. Now, in the coding interview, this might be okay to use like an AI assistant, but they might tell you to turn it off. So be prepared to like copy and paste everything in here. So now we satisfied number one. Okay. So this is done. Number two, we need to hit that API. So how do we do that? So the scope of the project already has this user API, and this is using Axios on the back end as well. So this will have access to our users API. So the way you would do that in React is a simple way. You could use side effects, right? So side effect is a way for React to fetch data, post data. If you need to refresh data in any way, you could do that in functional components using a side effect like useEffect, which is a custom hook. So I'm going to be using useEffect to do that. But first, I need to define a state. So the state that I want to define here is going to be called users, and it's going to be an array. And it's going to use that user interface type. Then I'm going to create a useEffect hook, and then add in our user dot get users endpoint with a dot then, right? Because we want to get the data for that endpoint. Then from there, we want to do a check. So what I want to do here is I want to check to see if we do have a response and that the response dot status is equal to 200. This will tell us that the response back, the promise that we're getting back from this API, if it's equal to 200, that means that we got a successful response and that we're going to get the data now. Okay. If it didn't, it will be a different error code like a 402, 502, 422, whatever. It would show up there and it will show up in the console. So what I'm going to do here is do set users, right? Because we know that is going to be successful. And I'm going to get the data from that user's endpoint. Okay. Now I'm going to console log that out to the screen here. So let me save that. Let's go to our screen. What's wrong here? Looks like we got an error. Hold on one second. All right, so the error here is that the use effect, well, the API wasn't closed out. So that makes total sense. That's why it was doing that. And then we need an arrow function there. Cool. That was the error. So make sure you have your parentheses in the right place. So now if I go into the browser, click on the console, you can see now that we got our users, right? We should be good to go here. So now that we got this data, what we need to do now is create an unordered list. So how do you do that? So you would do something like this, users.map. Well, you can actually check to see if there's a users, if it's empty. So I'm going to do dot length. And if it's greater than 0, I want to output an unordered list from that list. So the way we would do this is we would use a dot map. And this dot map, hold on a second, will loop through the entire list of users. And depending on what data you want to show, it will display. So right now I have like these empty brackets here, right? This code syntax. This is just a React fragment, so it's similar to like a div. So what I'm going to do now is create a map, and I'm going to map through. I'm going to create an unordered list for this, and then map through every single user. Okay, so every single list item in here will have its own place. So let me just clean this up a little bit. And we're missing a right there, right? And now we go back to the UI. You can see now we're getting that unordered list for every single user, right? So this is printing out all the data from that API. The next thing that we need to do is just create a string that will tell us where the information about the user and what their hobby is. So what we're going to do here is use ES6 syntax, and this will allow us to destructure or show data within a string. So you don't have to do the JavaScript way, which is like, plus this name, that name, so on and so forth, and encapsulating it into a string. So this is how I'm going to do it. So we're going to do user first name, and we're also going to include the last name is from user state, and their hobby is the hobby. So this makes it super easy, especially with Codium. Like you see how quick that was, right? And we'll be able to output that to the screen, and you can see all this info is now displayed here, right? And this is what the question is asking for. So this shows that you know how to map through an array, you know how to get the data from that array, and now put it to the screen, and then also create dynamic elements using that method. So this is great. So now this part is done. Number 3 is super simple. So now we have to create an input field. So how do we do that? Easiest way to do it is, because we have data here, you know what we could do? We could create an input field. So this input field would have a type, a type of text, which will tell us that this is an input text field. And then the placeholder will be hobby. So this will tell the user in the input field exactly what you're asking for. So then here, we also want to have a submit button, or a button that submits that action to update the user in question with the new hobby. Okay, so when I'm reading that question out, what I want here is to refresh the data once that's done. So I'm going to create a refresh state. And this state here will allow us to to call the use effect again to refetch the API, the user's API with the latest data. Um, and this is why you would use a use effect. So like if you wanted to update like an API and then you wanted to refresh that data based off of a Boolean change, you can easily do that with that state. So that's why I'm adding refresh to this dependency array. So whenever this changes from true to false, this will refetch that data. And then we want to change the default value here to false because we're dealing with Booleans. Perfect. Okay. So now that we got that set up, we need to then tie this in. So like if you look at the UI, if it wants to save this and then go back to the UI, you can see now we have an input field, right? So we could type in this and we could click on the submit, but it doesn't do anything yet. So to wire this up, we need to create a callback function. And this callback function will handle the on change event, or actually you probably don't even have to do all that. What you can do is do on change, which will basically any keystroke that you're doing on the input field, we will track the change event there, right? Then you would do this, create an arrow function. I'm going to have event in here. This type is a change event HTML input element when you're dealing with that. And then you're going to arrow that out and we're going to set our state, well, we actually have to create a new state for that, which is hobby, which will be a string. And we're going to set our hobby to the event.target.value, right? So this is anything that's in this input field, whatever you type is going to be set as state in real time. And I can show you what that looks like in the console log. Perfect. Okay. So now if I change it to like going to the gym, you can see on the right hand side in the console all of my keyframes. So if I go back to nothing, if I add in ABC, you can see we're keeping track of that and the state is updating correctly. So this is great. Now we need to hook up this button to then update that user with that new hobby. So this is how we're going to handle this. We're going to call this submit hobby, and we're going to do something similar to this, but and I'll explain exactly what we're doing here. But also we want to create an if statement here to check if the refresh state is true. We want to set that back to false. Then since that's set back to false, we want to hit this API with the ID of 2 and send down the hobby. And this won't be a put, this will actually be a patch. And the reason why this is a patch is because we're only updating one piece of that object. We're not updating the entire object. So if you're updating the entire object, you would do a dot put and you will have all the properties spread within this, okay? So we're going to look for the response. If it's a 200, then we'll refresh it. And then we should be able to get the latest hobby for that user. So now we're just going to lock this in and then tie this to that submit button. And I would do an on-clicked event handler, right? Arrow function, submit hobby. We'll do it that way. Well, actually, you don't even have to do that. You could just probably just do it like this. But, you know, based off of syntax, I usually like to do an arrow functions just in case. Okay. So now that we got that all wired up, let's change. So this is going to be the user that we're going to be updating. So you can see painting is the hobby, right? So I'm going to change this to going to the gym. And I'm going to submit this. You can see it updates, okay? If I say taking a nap, same thing, it updates. So like we're refreshing every single time we're clicking that submit button because we're handling the state of that refresh. All right. So that satisfies question number 3. And the more you start to go down the list of questions and you start to write out the code, you're going to actually, is it going to be easier for the other questions too? Okay. So another thing that we need to do is create another text field with a button that will filter out the users based off of the state. So we could just copy what we have here, and yeah, we'll leave it as is for now. And I'm going to change this to state, and we want another state here that will keep track of the new state that we want to filter on. Okay, so this will be state, and actually I'm going to change this to updated state, because in React you could do this dot set state, and it just makes sense just to do it this way. It's just easier to keep track of. Um, but you could do set updated state to this. So now we should be able to add in that state. Now, before we do this, and actually I'm just going to keep it in just in case so we can refactor it later. But there's an issue with this, but I want you guys to like point it out once we go through the demo. So right now we have to create another event, well, a callback function that will handle or submit the state filter. And we're not going to call anything in the API. We're not going to do any of that. What we are going to do is call this filtered users. And we are going to make sure that the user state equals, and there's a typo here, it should be update, equals to the update state. And what should happen is we're going to set users to that filtered state, right? And what should happen is we should overwrite the API list to this now filtered list that should show all of the users that belong to a particular state. Okay, so this is pretty, and you can see Codium, I clicked on explain, and it explains exactly what this function is doing, which is another reason why you should get it. But this is all this function is doing. This is all we're going to be doing here. And we just need to wire this up. When we click that and update this, say for example, if I did like New Jersey, right? Click submit. Now we only filtered to that data. If I was to do like California, now we got a problem, because you see everything went away, right? Why is that? The reason why this happened is because that user's object, that user state, is the length is now 0. So if it's not greater than 0, we won't see anything in here. So that breaks the application. So the way we would fix it is 2 things. One thing is that we only have abbreviations of the state in our user object. We can't do the entire state. So we need to add a max length to this input field and equal it to 2, since all state abbreviations are only 2 letters. That's why that's not working. And then the last question here is that we have to add a reset button. So what is that button going to do? All it's going to do right here, if you do users.length equals to 0, we want to output that button, that reset button. And all we need to do is create that button and then added some logic so that the button actually shows up. So I'm just going to copy, or actually, I don't even need to do all that. I could just do button reset. And I am going to just add an on-click event. So on-click, another arrow function, And then we're going to do set refresh to this. And another way to do this too is if you do previous, which is the previous state, and then you would just do that too. Whichever you prefer, there's many different ways to update state this way. But this will ensure us that whenever that happens, when we won't have data on the page, we'll have a reset button that will show up to get us back on track. Okay. So if I do CA, you could tell I can't type anymore. You can hear me typing. I can't do it. There's only 2 characters. I click submit. Okay, cool. If I hit NJ, no users, and we can make this more refined as well. If you want to get brownie points for this, you could do, so we could create a open and close React fragment. And then you could just add, probably do like a H3 and say there are no users for that state. Please reset the list, right? So we save that, we go back to our code, we do boom, I do NY, boom. You can see now we got this, click back, we can change the hobby to something else, watching TV, this updates, so on and so forth. So we can do MA, it filters out that list. So this is a working example of how you would go about solving a coding challenge really, really quick. And I mean, I wanted to explain this as slow as possible so you could understand. And if you want this code and you want to play around with it some more so that you can add this to your portfolio, let me know. I'll probably add a poll on YouTube just to see if you guys actually want this. If you do, I'll include the source code and all that stuff on GitHub. You could pull that. You can make changes to it, whatever you want to do. All right. And then one last thing I want to show you guys. So like whenever you're mapping through an object, you could either define it as like whatever the singular of that object is. So if it's a bunch of users, you could use user. Or what I like to do is destructure all of the data that I care about. Because there might be some times where you don't need all the data for that map, right? Like I don't need ID in here and all that stuff. So I don't want to necessarily bring down all those resources. So if you want to just remove the user dot, all you have to do is do Control D or Command D and then hit backspace. And it should just take care of all of the pairs like that. Boom, like so. So it makes it easier. So you'd have to do a find and replace and all that stuff. So, and if I save this, go back, you can see that the data is still there. Like everything works. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, like I said, just let me know and we'll go back to the video. So as you can see, the code itself, that's going to help you be successful when doing these coding interviews. All right. If you don't do that, you're going to have a problem. So here are the big lessons that I've learned in this process, right? And this has set me up for success for any other interview that I had to do. I had to calm down my ego, right? So don't think that you know everything. That's number one. Number two is practice. Make sure that you practice interviewing. Make sure that you practice exactly what the requirements are for the interview, what technology stack that they're using, understand the company culture, understand the problem that they're trying to solve, because that's going to definitely come up in an interview. And if you can't answer that, that's an issue that will disqualify you, okay? Another thing, if there is a job that you really care about, you're going to spend time preparing as much as possible, but then also you don't want to sit there on an interview and waste people's time. Okay. If you're not prepared, you're not only doing yourself a disservice, you're doing the interviewers a disservice as well. You're wasting their time. So make sure that you prepare as much as possible and practice and make sure that you're confident. Like you see how I am in front of this camera, right? Like I'm sitting confidently and I'm speaking to you slowly so you understand exactly what I'm saying. And you could just tell that I'm confident in what I'm telling you guys. It's not like I'm reading from a script and reading verbatim what's on that script. I'm talking from whatever's in here. Being that natural and loose is going to help you with the interview process, and being more personable. Being more personable and not just like, I code this and I code that, that's it. And just being nonchalant with your answers is going to help you with the interview process. As software developers, we tend to just be all about the code and get rid of all of our other soft skills. Communication is very important, and it could open up a lot of more opportunities for you in the future. And as a senior developer, you have to communicate a lot. So make sure that you work on these things. Interview prep. If you need help from me to do an interview prep, if you got interviews coming down the line, you could reach out to me on IG or TikTok. Okay. I have the links right here in the description. And then also you can hit me up on Gmail at thefullstackbro@gmail.com. If you need help with interview prepping, just understanding exactly where you need to be. Ultimately, I want you guys to succeed in this job market. Like right now, the job market is not good. It's not good. A lot of people are overinflating their resumes with a bunch of BS, and it's making it a lot harder for these companies to vet that out because of AI. If you need help to leapfrog above a lot of those candidates, reach out to me. I can help you get there. Okay. So if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Let people know. If you found this helpful, share the video to other people. I want to see you guys in the comments, man. Like, talk about the worst interview you ever had. I mean, like, no one's going to judge you here. Just be open about like your interviews, and we could work together to get this done. All right. Talk soon.